At the beginning of June, Ukraine hit Russia with a devastating 1-2 punch. According to SBU, it first took out a third of Russia's bomber fleet as part of Operation Spiderweb. Russia was already reeling. Then, it hit the Kerch Bridge with an underwater drone. 2 attacks over 3 days. Russia was exposed. And that's a problem for Putin. Ukraine's unbelievable successes in these 2 attacks have triggered an internal collapse in Putin's regime. As we speak, that regime is falling apart, devouring itself as Putin looks for somebody to blame. We'll explain how in a moment. First, a quick recap. On June 1st, Ukraine launched an operation that was 18 months in the making, according to The Guardian. Operation Spiderweb saw it sneak trucks full of drones into Russia. Those trucks were stored in warehouses, with Ukraine hiding its drones in specially built wooden containers that had secret roof compartments. When Ukraine was ready to strike, it called unwitting Russian drivers and told them to drive the trucks to locations close to 4 air bases dotted around Russia. The trucks arrived at their locations. Ukraine triggered the secret roof compartments. Within minutes, dozens of quadcopter first-person view drones rose from their containers, each carrying explosives intended to destroy Russia's aerial assets. The damage caused rocked Putin and any belief he may have had in Russia's aerial might. By the end of the attack, Ukraine's SBU believed it had damaged 41 Russian planes, including a pair of A-50 surveillance aircraft and multiple Tu-160, Tu-22, and Tu-95 bombers. The cost to Russia? $7 billion of military hardware went up in smoke as it lost about a third of its active bomber fleet. The attack was devastating, and Ukraine gave Putin no time to lick his wounds and figure out what the hell had just happened. Just 2 days later, Ukraine set its sights on the Kerch Bridge, also known as the Crimean Bridge, which connects mainland Russia to the annexed Crimean Peninsula. That bridge has emerged as a logistical artery for Russia. Putin's forces used the railway built onto the bridge to transport troops, supplies, and equipment into Crimea, much of which finds its way into southern Ukraine. At 4:44 a.m., the SBU gave the order and an explosion rocked the Kerch Bridge. According to reports, we later found out that Ukraine had used stealthy underwater drones to mine the piers supporting the bridge's road before planting explosives. As with Operation Spiderweb, the mission was months in the making. By the time the SBU was ready to go, it had planted a staggering 2,420 pounds of explosives on the bridge, all under Russia's nose, all without Putin knowing a thing. Ukraine didn't destroy the Kerch Bridge, however, it did force a temporary closure, and more importantly, it sent a message to Putin. His $3.7 billion bridge isn't safe. The symbol of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is as much of a target as the many air bases struck during Operation Spiderweb. And once again, Ukraine had managed to pull off a covert operation about which Putin and his cronies had no idea. Those are the headlines from Ukraine's 2 attacks. But what's really important here is the aftermath. The reality that Putin now faces is that these 2 covert strikes have exposed Russia's military, the Kremlin, and the very people with whom Putin surrounds himself as incompetent. Worse yet for Russia's leader, Ukraine's exploits at the beginning of June have triggered a collapse from which Putin's regime may never recover. On June 8th, Times Radio published a video on YouTube featuring its host of Frontline, Philip Ingram. A former British military intelligence officer, Ingram is one of Time Radio's foremost Ukraine war analysts, and he, along with several interview guests, had plenty to say about what Ukraine really achieved with its pair of strikes in early June. For a start, Ingram points out we're already starting to see the fallout. It's been very embarrassing to the Russians, Ingram says when speaking about Operation Spiderweb. So embarrassing that the head of the Russian Air Force has had a small accident and committed suicide. It's unclear who Ingram may be speaking about here. There are rumors that Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylas has experienced an unfortunate accident, though this currently amounts to a handful of posts on social media. Still, it would be no surprise if this supposed suicide happened. Russian sudden death syndrome is a strange phenomenon that seems to catch up to prominent officials not long after they've angered Putin. As the Diplomatic Courier noted in March 2023, 9 senior Russian diplomatic corps officials have experienced this terrible ailment between 2016 and 2023. All died in mysterious circumstances, including undisclosed ailments, gunshot wounds, and supposed suicide by diving out of windows. Could the head of Russia's Air Force have become the latest victim following Operation Spiderweb? It's possible. This would certainly fit Putin's modus operandi. He punishes with death those who fail him, which means more sudden deaths may be coming in the wake of Operation Spiderweb. But all of that is par for the course for Putin. Far more worrying for Russia's leader, as several of Ingram's interview subjects point out, is that the combination of Operation Spiderweb and the Kerch Bridge strikes have demonstrated just how weak his internal defenses are. Ukraine knows exactly what to hit and how, and Putin knows it. That's according to author and foreign policy analyst Malcolm Nance, who spoke to Ingram following Operation Spiderweb. Operation Spiderweb leverages the fact that Ukrainians and Russians, for a very long time under the Soviet Union, were fused together as a forced society. So those SBU officers know where these air bases are, probably picnicked in many of these areas, says Nance. The irony here is that Putin's rhetoric about why he started the Ukraine war has come back to bite him. Russia's leader has long claimed that Russians and Ukrainian are one people. They aren't, at least not in the eyes of Ukrainians. However, the forced union that took place during the Soviet era has delivered everything that Ukraine needs to know about the biggest targets it can hit on Russian territory. Putin knows it, and he can't do anything about it. It seems that supposed historical unity also comes with its problems. And those problems, born from Ukraine's knowledge of Russia's internal workings, are what allowed Operation Spiderweb to happen in the first place. This was no small operation. It required many spies inserted into Russia, as Nance points out. This really required an enormous number of spies in Russia. The logistics chain that they set up to actually assemble, test, develop this weapons system's card deck is just full of aces, Nance says. He mentions that, if nothing else, Operation Spiderweb proves that Ukraine holds many more cards than Putin would want to believe. If we examine it in detail, I understand that the Ukrainians in October 2024 set up a company in Russia that was a haulage company, and they bought haulage trucks and all the rest of it, Nance says while explaining how Ukraine pulled off Operation Spiderweb. They then had these prefabricated buildings that they had put capabilities in, communication capabilities in it, and the drones in the roof of it. Nance's point is that Ukraine managed to conduct Operation Spiderweb almost entirely on Russian soil in an extremely complex operation. Why is that another sign of the Putin regime's impending collapse? Think about the complexity of such an operation. Dozens of Ukrainian spies were working inside Russia for over a year, setting up companies and purchasing the equipment they needed. Putin saw none of it. His intelligence forces had no idea any of this was happening, which exposes rampant incompetence that goes all the way to the top of the Kremlin. And the worst of it, at least for Putin, is that Ukraine likely had spies operating in Russia long before planning began for Operation Spiderweb. So before we can even talk about 2024 and establishing the operation, they had an enormous base of human intelligence. People who were on the ground, lived in Russia, had trucking companies, knew where the mafia was, knew how to buy things you couldn't get, knew how and when to trade caviar for ammunition, Nance says. In other words, Ukraine knows that the Russian system is fueled by corruption. There would have been people inside Russia who knew that something smelt fishy, that there were these supposed business owners who were buying weapons and equipment via black market sources. But nobody asked any questions. Why would they? The money was rolling in as Ukraine's spy network grew larger and laid the foundations for what would become Operation Spiderweb. People think spies are penetration agents, right? They're the guys who go in dressed as a Russian officer. You don't have to do that, Nance explains. Real spies are the guys who set up hauling companies, who actually have to buy food on a daily basis in order to support 10 or 15 safe houses, keep weapons, ammunition, and field kits on the ready, establish covert communications back to their higher headquarters, or even, using the Russian telephone system. Russia has long prided itself on its spying network. In March, the BBC reported that 6 Bulgarian nationals were convicted of running a sophisticated Russian spy ring in the UK, conducting multiple espionage operations over several years. However, Russia's focus on its own spies has led it to taking its collective eye off the ball. That inability to see the spies right under its nose is what allowed Operation Spiderweb to happen. As for Putin, he knows one important thing. There may be many more Ukrainian spies operating under his nose, and nobody in his regime seems to know anything about them. Let's switch focus to the Kerch Bridge attack for a moment. Ingram also speaks to somebody identified as Operator Starsky, who is a Ukrainian war veteran who also operates his own YouTube channel. Starsky suggests that the Kerch Bridge attack has put the thought of losing Crimea in Putin's mind. That's something Russia's leader never wants to have to contemplate. If they lose Crimea, of course, it will be a devastating blow, not only politically to Russia, but also psychologically and from the standpoint of morale of the people, of the Russian citizens, Starsky explains. He has a point. Crimea matters so much to Putin because it helps to prop up his regime. As Sky News explained in April, the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula sparked a new wave of patriotism in Russia, with "Crimea is ours" becoming a rallying cry that Putin rode to his full-fledged Ukraine invasion in February 2022. Putin himself has called Crimea a sacred place, and he actively prosecutes people who argue publicly that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. Without Crimea, the public support Putin believes he enjoys from his people starts to crumble. And with it goes one of the most vital military assets Putin has in his arsenal: This place historically allocated a lot of Russian military, Starsky explains. Their intelligence, there's a lot of bases used for intelligence, for collecting data, radio electronic intelligence, and things like that. A lot of very important facilities. And also, this place is currently being used as a big military hub, Starsky says of Crimea. By attacking the Kerch Bridge successfully, Ukraine has just shown Putin that what he believes was one of the most important seats of his power is vulnerable. It hasn't necessarily set the stage for the reclamation of Crimea for Ukraine, but Putin knows that's Ukraine's ultimate goal. And just as with Operation Spiderweb, the fact that neither he nor his people even realized that there was a months-long operation happening at the Kerch Bridge showcases a level of incompetence that Putin doesn't want the average Russian to see. The Kerch Bridge is Putin's power project. Destruction of this bridge will, of course, be again a devastating blow also to Putin himself, Starsky says, because Putin made this bridge kind of his own project. We all saw him driving a truck or a car down that bridge when it just opened. In other words, the Kerch Bridge is a symbol of Putin's power. It's also a symbol of Russia's occupation of Crimea, as the BBC explained in July 2023, soon after Ukraine first targeted this monument to Putin's supposed power. As the BBC said at the time, "But this is unlikely to be the last attack. As long as it serves any military purpose for Russia, it'll remain in Kyiv's sights." Ukraine proved that statement true on June 3rd. When asked if the attack on the Kerch Bridge will affect Russian morale from a negative perspective, Starsky chuckles before saying, "I can tell you definitely that it did, because I'm monitoring Russian Telegram channels." He notes that Russia decrying the Kerch Bridge strike as a terrorist attack, along with Operation Spiderweb, is absolutely Russian style. Just call everything terrorists, call everybody Nazi. Desperation is starting to creep in to Putin's rhetoric. He's looking for scapegoats on whom to blame Ukraine's massive successes. His big problem, as Jason J. Smart reveals in his analysis from the fallout from Operation Spiderweb and the Kerch Bridge strike, is that he's not going to find anybody who's willing to take the blame for the many failures that led to these attacks. Smart, who is a national security and political consultant, explains that not a lot is coming out of the Kremlin in the wake of Ukraine's strikes. The real story is unfolding inside the Kremlin right now as we speak, he said during a June 3rd video that served as a follow-up to what Ukraine achieved with Operation Spiderweb. Inside the Kremlin there is fear, silence, and blame, working together with suspicion to spiral out of control, to create a witch hunt because there's a big looming question: did somebody on the inside allow this to happen? That's something Putin would never have wanted to consider. Russia's leader expects complete loyalty from his people. Way back in 2014, Andrei Malgin, writing for the Moscow Times, explained that Putin's main principle has always been loyalty in exchange for corruption. Malgin said that Putin allows and encourages his officials to steal because doing so allows him to guarantee their loyalty to him. Corruption enriches his officials, and as long as those around him are making money, Putin feels that they owe him their loyalty. The possibility that this system isn't working anymore is another sign that Putin's regime is crumbling. In truth, the corruption for loyalty approach was always one that had a shaky foundation. Even if none of his people actually betrayed him, Putin will look for somebody to blame. He'll find an official or several and punish them with death. And then that will send a message to others around Putin that no matter how loyal they may be, they'll still be targets if the very corruption that Putin encourages comes back to bite Russia. Putin's problem now, as Smart explains, is that Operation Spiderweb has degraded Russia's power. By hitting these bases, Ukraine didn't just hit hardware, they degraded Russia's ability to project nuclear and conventional power across 3 global theaters, Smart says. Worse yet, there's nothing that Russia can do about that degradation. But here's the kicker: Russia cannot replace those bombers. They don't have the manufacturing capacity. Many of these aircraft were built in Soviet plants that no longer exist or are simply located outside of Russia's modern borders, Smart explains. This assessment is backed by a June Moscow Times report which quotes the Royal United Services Institute's Justin Bronk, as he points out that Russia's planned PAC-DA plans to build a new series of bombers won't come to fruition anytime soon either. Russia will struggle to deliver the PAC-DA program at all in the coming 5 years, let alone accelerate it, due to budgetary shortfalls and materials and technology constraints on industry due to sanctions. So Putin has no new bombers incoming. He's just lost a third of his existing fleet. It's all degradation of Putin's military power projection, which in turn is another sign the regime he built around himself, which depended on that power, is collapsing. The cracks have been exposed by Operation Spiderweb and the Kerch Bridge mission. Cracks that show us there's a system-wide failure that's dividing Russia's military to the point that it may never recover. This was a system-wide national security failure in Russia, involving both the military as well as the intelligence service, Smart says. And to understand the fallout, you have to understand the Kremlin's internal war. Smart goes on to explain that Russia's FSB, which is the successor to the KGB, and the Russian General Staff are jointly responsible for the country's military command. Those two institutions don't get along. They've never trusted each other, and it's a rivalry that goes way back into the Soviet period. But today it's far, far more dangerous, Smart explains. Since Putin came to power, he says, they've been battling over budgets, operational control, and ultimately Putin's favor. The FSB sees the Russian military as bloated and corrupt, Smart says. The military, on the other hand, sees the FSB as paranoid, power-hungry, and way too political. What Putin has created around himself, Smart is saying, is a pair of warring factions that are jointly responsible for ensuring that he achieves victory in Ukraine. Think about what that means for a moment. The FSB and the Russian General Staff want to expose one another. In doing so, they each hope to curry more favor with Putin. That creates an obvious problem. Could people in either organization have learned of Ukraine's June operations and simply not said anything? The FSB looks bad when Ukrainian spies succeed on Russian soil, which may have been all the motivation that other parties, such as the General Staff, needed to keep their mouths shut. It's a possibility, but we'll never know for sure. What we do know, according to Smart, is that any investigation that Putin conducts into what went wrong to allow Operation Spiderweb and the Kerch Bridge bombing to occur will be brutal. The deeper that anyone digs into this, they will uncover significant corruption. They will uncover the fake brigades, the stolen fuel, the radar systems that only exist on paper. If the FSB starts to pull threads, Smart explains, the illusion of Russia's military strength will collapse around Putin as his entire regime starts to crumble. And during it all, Putin is alone. Putin is isolated. He's surrounded by people who lie to him. He's surrounded by people who fear him. And he's surrounded by people who hide the truth from him, Smart says. And perhaps that's the most important thing that Ukraine's strikes exposed. Putin is now caught in a trap of his own design, standing atop a regime that ensures the information he needs to know never gets through to him. Any attempt to buck the regime he created, such as eliminating the corruption he previously encouraged, will only lead to internal rebellion. If Putin isn't careful, Operation Spiderweb and the Kerch Bridge strike will do more than damage valuable Russian military assets. They'll set the stage for his dethroning as Russia's leader. And as all of this is happening, Russia's air force is collapsing. Check out our video, which examines the impressive Ukrainian strike rate that further exposes Russia's military incompetence today. And remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war.